The grave had no name, just a patch of scorched grass behind the abandoned Wexley house, where even children refused to play. Locals said the land was cursed, that nothing bloomed near the steps, not even weeds. But in the spring of 1862, when a Union detachment passed through Wexley Hollow during the last push toward Richmond, they uncovered something in the thawed earth that chilled even seasoned soldiers. Beneath the crumbling garden wall, where blackberry brambles had twisted into barbed knots, the boot of a cavalryman struck something hard. At first, they assumed it was a root, but when the second strike echoed with a hollow thud, they dug. It wasn't a root, it was a box, and inside the box bones, small bones, children's bones, and the house behind them. That was the Wexley property. Once a school for young girls, now silent, empty since 1843, when the townspeople claimed the widow Wexley had died in her sleep. A good woman, they'd said, a teacher, a pious soul who gave troubled girls a second chance. But the grave in the yard was new, and when the soldiers reported the discovery to the local records officer, they received an envelope marked, "Sealed by order of County Commission. Do not reopen." That was the first red flag. The second came when they looked into the town's census books. Ruth Ann Wexley was listed as deceased, but her death certificate had no date, no cause, no coroner's name. Only one line: committed to earth with scripture and silence. If you've ever thought evil only exists in the loud, the violent, the monstrous, you need to hear this story. Because Ruth Ann Wexley didn't kill in rage. She didn't butcher, scream, or revel in chaos. She whispered, she wrote, she watched, and what she left behind was a theology of silence more terrifying than any scream. Before we open her ledger, before we unseal what the county tried to erase, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell. What you're about to hear is a story they buried, but every time it's told, it rises again. The house on Calvary Hill wasn't always feared. In fact, in the 1830s, it was considered the pride of Wexley Hollow, a two-story clapboard home with green shutters and a school bell that chimed at 7 a.m. every weekday. Ruth Ann Wexley had transformed her husband's estate into a finishing school for girls too difficult for their parents, too rebellious for the convent, or too poor for city institutions. She welcomed them all. Girls from broken homes, girls who'd been caught stealing, fighting, lying, girls who didn't speak, and girls who wouldn't stop screaming. She called them her lost flock, and to the townspeople she was a saint. Widowed young after her husband's drowning on the Dan River, Ruth was said to have found purpose in discipline and scripture. She wore only black, never cut her hair, and never missed church. In public, she was soft-spoken and generous. She played the organ on Sundays and sewed quilts for the poor in winter. But inside the school, things were different. We know this because of a letter. A single letter written by a girl named Eleanor Prince, sent to her cousin in Richmond in the spring of 1842. They tell us to speak only when spoken to, but even when I am silent, I feel her eyes. She says there are punishments for disobedience, but worse ones for dishonesty. I do not know what I've done. The other girls won't look at me. They say I'll be sent to the Crimson Room. The Crimson Room. It comes up again and again, across different letters, across different years. A place in the attic, a locked door behind the bell tower. Always spoken of in whispers. Always the final warning. But Eleanor's letter never reached her cousin. It was intercepted by the postmaster, who flagged it for disturbing language and filed it away. That letter wasn't found until 1910, when the post office caught fire and townspeople sifted through the charred records. By then, Eleanor had been listed as deceased. Cause: tuberculosis. But no doctor had signed her death certificate, and no grave could be found with her name. You might ask, how did no one notice? How could a dozen girls disappear from a single house without raising suspicion? They did. Some did. There were murmurs. A constable named Henry Doolin filed 2 requests to inspect the Wexley property after the disappearance of Mary Catherine Black, a 10-year-old whose father was a coal surveyor. His request was denied. Why? Because the school was considered a private institution, and Mrs. Wexley had donated generously to the local courthouse every year since her husband's death. But Henry Doolin didn't let it go. In the winter of 1843, he went to the Wexley property himself. He was seen speaking to the widow at her door, holding a leather-bound notebook. Witnesses say she invited him inside. He never came out. 2 days later, the house caught fire. Not enough to destroy it, just enough to char the east wing. Ruth was found in bed, unburnt, with a candle still lit at her bedside. The coroner ruled it heart failure. Her death was recorded without autopsy. No further investigations were made. And so, the house remained, abandoned, sealed by the county, a relic of a sainted schoolteacher's noble work, until 1862, when that soldier's boot struck the box. Inside were the bones of 4 children, stacked neatly. No trauma on the skulls, no marks of violence, but curled, arms folded, like they had lain there willingly, or had been placed there with care. The soldier who found the box kept a diary. In it, he wrote, "There was a smell, not rot, not blood, something sweet, like sugar water or wilted roses. It didn't make sense. Nothing bloomed in that yard." We now believe Ruth had help, that at least one of her surviving students continued her work, maybe even arranged her burial, because someone, years later, placed a small iron cross at the base of that box, inscribed with just one word, obedience. The name Ruth Ann Wexley would fade from public record, but in secret circles she became a whispered legend, a ghost story, a cautionary tale told in finishing schools and rural convents, a woman who purified disobedience through silence and taught her girls how to listen, not with ears, but with fear. In Part 2, we'll go back to the girls themselves, to the punishments, to the rituals, and to the doctrine of control that Ruth Ann Wexley believed was not cruelty, but a lesson. And the lesson, it never ended. They called it the doctrine of stillness. But it wasn't written in any book. It was passed mouth to ear, from Ruth Ann Wexley to her girls, enforced not with violence, but with silence. According to recovered testimonies from surviving pupils decades later, there were no screams at Calvary Hill, no outbursts, no beatings. There were only looks, long pauses, withheld food, and long hours kneeling on cold floorboards while the air thickened with the smell of candle wax and damp wood. Stillness, Ruth Ann once said to her students during a morning recitation, is where the soul meets its reflection. The younger girls were trained first. At age 6, they learned not to speak unless called. By 8, they were expected to rise and sleep without prompting. By 10, they memorized the Book of Ruth by heart. And if they faltered, they were led to the west stairwell, what the girls called the listening hall, where they would sit in complete darkness for hours, sometimes days, and not emerge until they could recite their assigned passage perfectly. No one dared ask what happened to the girls who were taken to the Crimson Room. Not until years later did the name resurface. First, in the personal diary of a woman named Miriam Eves, once a student at Wexley School for Girls, who later became a midwife in Baton Rouge. Her diary, discovered by her grandchildren after her death in 1908, included a torn, water-stained page titled simply, "What I Saw." It read, "I woke when I wasn't supposed to." She had taken Cora upstairs, said she needed prayer, but I heard something else, a sound like wet fabric slapping tile, a scraping noise like someone dragging something heavy. I crept from bed. I followed the glow from her candle. I shouldn't have. The door was open, just an inch. I saw Cora's feet, not moving, clean. So clean. Ruth had her hands folded. She wasn't praying. She was whispering. Miriam never told anyone what she saw while Ruth was alive. She left the school the next year, allegedly sent away due to weak constitution and disobedience. But her diary suggests otherwise. It implies that once a girl knew too much, Ruth arranged for their removal, not by force, but by silence. The girl would be declared unfit, sickly, even mad, and sent away to distant relatives or obscure convents where no questions would be asked. But some didn't make it out. In 1841, the town's blacksmith, Ernest Hallam, reported seeing a girl wandering the backwoods in a state of fright, wearing a Wexley uniform. She was barefoot, and her hands were torn from brambles. She didn't speak. When the blacksmith approached, she ran. No one found her again. Ruth claimed she had no knowledge of any missing girl and suggested the child might have been an orphan from the next town. Ernest Hallam pressed no further. Weeks later, his foundry was destroyed in a fire. Official cause, lightning. But locals knew the sky had been clear that night. This pattern of misdirection, of punishment hidden in consequence, was part of what made Ruth Ann Wexley so dangerous. She didn't need chains or weapons. She used shame. She weaponized it, coded it in theology, and planted it in the minds of girls already discarded by society. If they disobeyed, it meant they were ungrateful. If they questioned, it meant they were unholy. If they fled, it meant they were already lost. And no one saved the lost. Another key piece of the puzzle came from the 1864 journal of Private Lewis Grant, one of the Union soldiers who originally uncovered the bone box on the Wexley property. He returned to the site alone 2 weeks after the official discovery, unable to sleep since finding the remains. In his journal, he wrote, "I thought if I saw it again, I could convince myself it wasn't what I feared, that the bones weren't children, that the box wasn't made for burial but storage. But it was worse than I remembered. There were others. I found 3 more, smaller, hidden behind the ivy wall. I couldn't bring them back. I couldn't carry it. I'm not sure if I ever left that place, even now." Private Grant died by suicide 2 years later. His journal was sent to his family, but the final pages were torn out. Still, the pieces were adding up. In 1872, a woman named Charlotte Briggs, headmistress of a charity school in Savannah, received an anonymous parcel. Inside were 3 items: a dried magnolia petal, a bone rosary, and a torn page from an old hymnal. Scribbled in red ink at the bottom was the phrase, "The doctrine never ended. We just changed the name." Charlotte dismissed the package as a prank, until one of her pupils, Jane Elwell, began waking up in the middle of the night, whispering psalms that hadn't been taught at the school. When questioned, Jane claimed an old woman in a black dress visited her dreams. The dreams stopped only after the girl was withdrawn from school and moved out of state. Some believe Ruth's teaching survived in secret societies. Others say she had disciples, girls who fled but never escaped, girls who went on to lead institutions of their own. They taught not from books, but from memory, quietly, invisibly, in orphanages, asylums, charity homes, the doctrine of stillness, diluted but alive. And through it all, Ruth's house remained. It decayed, sank deeper into the earth, but it never collapsed. And despite multiple efforts by the town to demolish the building, Workers refused. The last attempt in 1887 ended when a mason named Tobias Kemp was crushed under scaffolding. His final words, heard by 2 witnesses, were, "The stairs moved. I swear they moved." They abandoned the demolition the next day. What haunts this story isn't just what Ruth Ann Wexley did. It's how long she did it. How many looked away. How many helped without realizing. How many still quote her rules without knowing their origin. Stillness. Obedience. Reflection. All dressed in Scripture. All framed in love. But love isn't what they found in that house. Not the girls. Not the ones who survived. Not the ones who never left. In Part 3, we'll unseal the ledger. Ruth's own writing. Because, yes, it exists. A diary, or perhaps a doctrine, found in the wall during the last investigation. Inside were names, dates, and phrases that weren't meant to be read. And the final page? It was blank, except for one line. The quietest ones make the best vessels. It was Reverend Amos Fletcher who broke the wall open, not out of curiosity, but because the infestation had become unbearable. In 1891, decades after Ruth Ann Wexley's death and long after the school had shuttered, the Calvary Hill property had become a place of whispered dares and drunken bets. Children from the outskirts dared each other to run the porch. Teenagers carved names into the floorboards, swearing they heard humming from beneath the parlor. But Amos Fletcher wasn't there to chase spirits. He'd bought the land, believing the house's dark reputation could be purified by holy intent. He was wrong. The infestation began with the flies. Thousands of them, thick as tar, clinging to the molding and light fixtures despite being sealed tight for years. Then came the smell, sickly sweet, like rotting fruit left in a child's lunch tin. Amos believed it to be an animal trapped behind the paneling. So he took a crowbar and broke into the northern wall of the former prayer room. Behind it, he found no corpse, just a narrow recess sealed at the back with a wooden panel. It was nailed shut with 10 rusted pins. The nails came out easy. The panel less so. It splintered like bone. Behind it was a cavity no larger than a coffin. Inside was the ledger. It was wrapped in silk, red, dulled by time, stiff with dust. A child's rosary sat atop it, beads warped, cross cracked down the middle. Beneath the rosary, a folded paper labeled, "Only those who remember may read." The book itself was handmade, bound with wax thread and pressed calfskin. It wasn't a journal in the modern sense. No dates, no greetings, no sense of a timeline. Just an accumulation of rules, reflections, names, and beneath many entries, a single red initial, R.W. The first pages were methodical. Lists of girls admitted to the school, birth names, baptismal names, notes in the margins, obedient, fractured, watchful, gifted with silence. But by the 5th page, the writing changed. Ruth's sentences became poetic, detached, often disturbing. Cora sees them before they pass. Her eyes tremble when the time comes. I think she knows which ones feed the house. Mary weeps not from pain, but from absence. There is nothing in her left to hurt. She is perfect. Each must bleed before dusk, or the words will rot. There was a system, a pattern. 1 child each season, selected, prepared, sent. The wording remained vague, but the repetition of phrases was undeniable. Stilled, lifted, given, always in red ink, always beneath the names. Historians who later examined the text couldn't agree whether the ledger was metaphorical or literal. Was Ruth documenting spiritual trials or physical acts? Were the children victims or vessels? The entries blurred doctrine and delusion. One page stood out. the only one in a different hand. It read, "She speaks at night, not aloud. I feel her in my teeth, my stomach. I wake up knowing things. She gave me her silence. I keep it now. I keep it well." There was no signature, but the page was dated July 18th, 1849. That was the same day Ruth Ann was hospitalized briefly at the nearby St. Raphael's Infirmary for what was called temporary spiritual collapse. The staff's records from that month are gone, except for one surviving physician's journal that noted, "She hummed for 12 hours, same 3 notes. We couldn't sedate her." After Ruth recovered, she returned to the school. No explanation, no apology, and the entries in the ledger grew colder. I no longer wait for signs. I make them. Stillness is the furnace in which all will is smelted. Some are born with too much blood. It must be shared. And finally, near the back, an entry that simply listed 12 names, first names only, under the heading, "Tithes Paid." Beneath each, a checkmark in red. The 12th name was Miriam. In 1908, after the diary's discovery, the ledger was handed to Dr. Clarence Rowe, a psychologist who specialized in religious delusion. He read it in full, annotated every page. But before his report could be published, he vanished. His home was found undisturbed. His office locked from the inside. All that remained was his copy of Ruth's ledger, open to a page he had titled The Vessel Doctrine. The note at the bottom of his page simply read, "The girls were not chosen because they were weak. They were chosen because they were open." The term vessel appeared dozens of times throughout Ruth's writings. She described the girls not as people, but as temples prepared for silence. She believed their trauma, their abandonment, their longing to be loved made them pure. Not in the moral sense, but in the structural one. An empty vessel, she wrote, could be filled with anything, and Ruth believed she was doing exactly that. In one chilling passage, she wrote, "The voice beneath the stairs cannot rise on its own. It requires lungs, bones, a willing throat. I provided these." It wasn't just doctrine, it was ritual, patterned, codified, enforced over decades with no external oversight, and worse, no interference. One of the last entries in the book was directed to an unnamed successor. "You will feel the itch, the crack in silence. Let it split you. Speak not with your lips, but with your choosing. Your choosing is the hymn." This raised the most terrifying possibility of all. Ruth intended for her legacy to continue. Not ideologically, but through a person, a successor, a girl groomed to carry on her rights in another location, under another name. And there is some evidence she succeeded. In 1931, a retired nurse named Edna Halwick, previously stationed at a girls' infirmary in Baton Rouge, gave an anonymous interview to a local folklorist. She recounted hearing of a woman in her youth, a strict but charismatic teacher named Miss Westerly, who taught girls to walk without sound, to sleep without dreams, and to give their voices to the house. Westerly's pupils were withdrawn, pale, brilliant at memorization. One girl, Edna claimed, died under unclear circumstances. No inquiry followed. No records were kept. Just a quick burial, a sealed coffin. When the folklorist showed Edna a faded photo of Ruth Ann Wexley, she went silent for several minutes. Then she whispered, "That's her," or "It's who she wanted to be." As we move to Part 4, we'll follow the trail of the successor and examine how a girl becomes a vessel, not all at once, but in stages, emotional, physical, ritual, because Ruth didn't just train killers, she trained caretakers. Caretakers of silence, of stillness, of something far older than doctrine. Underneath the floorboards of the Calvary Hill Schoolhouse, There were carvings. Not initials, not childish drawings, but full inscriptions, etched by hand into the beams and substructure, far beneath where any student should have ever been. Workers renovating the property in 1947 discovered them while reinforcing the foundation. Most were illegible. Time and rot had eaten the grain, but one phrase repeated often enough to be unmistakable. She rests beneath the still ones. This led to a horrifying realization. The ground beneath the school was not solid earth. It was hollowed in parts. A chamber of silence. Local authorities ordered a survey. Within a week, the team identified 12 depressions under the northwest wing, each exactly the size of a small coffin. No burial records existed. No corresponding church documents. No gravestones. But there were remnants. Hair fibers, bone fragments, buttons. Most disturbingly, a child's shoe, preserved almost entirely, with the letters M.R. burned into the sole. The name Miriam Rousseau appeared on Ruth's tithe list. She was the 12th girl, but Miriam was not the last. That became evident when researchers cross-referenced Ruth's ledger with missing persons reports from 1846 to 1851. The number of vanishings, particularly young girls from orphanages, rural missions, and poor parishes, was far higher than anyone previously thought. Most were written off as runaways. Some were claimed to have died from consumption, melancholia, or fever, with no bodies returned to families. But several of the names match those in the margins of Ruth's writing, names followed by single words: watched, unready, resisted, wilted. Resisted. That word shows up only 3 times in the entire book. In 2 of those entries, the name is underlined, and the page ends with a second set of notes, scribbled in haste, perhaps later added by Ruth herself. The silence recoiled. She was not emptied fully. Her blood carried fragments. Reassignment required. Returned to the room. She wept in colors. No sound. Still, she wept. Must observe. Whoever these girls were, they didn't vanish quietly. And Ruth seemed to interpret their resistance not as failure, but as impurity. She believed the process had to be repeated, that pain had to be calibrated, refined, re-administered until the subject was still enough to host something else. This introduces the term that appears only once, near the end of the ledger, in the margins beside a page written in smeared red ink: the inflection. It's not clear what it meant. Scholars have debated it for years. Some say it refers to a moment of spiritual possession. Others claim it was a psychological break, an irreversible point of indoctrination. But one theory, perhaps the most disturbing, is that the inflection was a ritual, a turning of the self inside out, and Ruth Ann Wexley had a method to reach it. In a hidden appendix sewn into the back cover of the ledger, later discovered after restoration efforts in 1954, there were diagrams, rough, childlike, but chilling. One depicted a small bed surrounded by mirrors. Another, a hallway of doors with a girl standing in front of each, eyes scratched out. One showed a girl holding a candle, surrounded by crows, all facing her. But the final diagram was the most horrific. It showed a girl kneeling on a tiled floor, arms outstretched. Above her, written in perfect calligraphy, "To empty the vessel, reverse the scream." What does that mean? One folklorist, Dr. Samira Ellis, theorized that Ruth believed sound itself was a binding force, that trauma, when unspoken, didn't dissipate, but rather condensed, hardened, became a structure. And that reversing the scream, forcing a child to internalize pain rather than release it, transformed that structure into a sanctuary for something else. Something ancient. Dr. Ellis compared it to certain early Gnostic sects that believed silence was not absence, but presence. That which cannot be spoken is that which is most powerful. In Ruth's world, silence was not peace. It was occupancy. And she wasn't alone in believing that. In 1871, a series of unsolved murders in Louisiana's Vermilion Parish were found to share a common detail. At each scene, a handwritten note was discovered. Phrases in Latin, accompanied by a strange symbol, a crescent above a box. Investigators at the time assumed it was cult activity, but in 1999, the symbol was matched to one found on a page of Ruth's ledger. The same mark appeared next to an entry that read, "Not all temples have walls. Some walk, some teach, some wait." It seemed Ruth believed that once a vessel was emptied and properly inflected, it became something more. Not a person, not a tool, but a site, a moving altar. That chilling belief would explain why so many of her victims were never buried. They were not, in her mind, dead. They were consecrated. This led to a new question, one which haunted researchers for years. What happened to the vessels that survived? If a girl had truly undergone the process Ruth described, repeated isolation, ritual silencing, symbolic inflection, what did she become? In 1967, a woman named Iris Duval, then 89 years old, confessed in a state of lucid delirium at St. Rose Hospice in Baton Rouge. She claimed that as a child, she had been brought to a school in the trees where she and 11 others were made to fast, recite psalms backward, and sleep underground. She remembered one teacher, Miss R. She remembered the mirrors, she remembered the red veil, and she remembered the voice. She didn't talk with her mouth. She talked with your thoughts. You knew she was near because your bones would hum, like a bell in your belly. When asked what happened to the others, Iris paused. Some stayed, some left, but not really. You don't leave her, you carry her. Before she passed away that evening, Iris left one final message with the nurse on duty. She asked it to be written exactly as she said it. She's not done. She's only paused. Stillness is not sleep, it's rehearsal. And with that, the nurse testified, Iris stopped breathing. As we move into Part 5, we explore the chilling possibility that Ruth's teachings didn't die with her, that they moved into others, into new forms, new locations, perhaps even into places we consider safe. Because once you accept the belief that silence is not the absence of sound, you have to ask, what is it making room for? In 1983, a demolition crew began dismantling what was left of the Calvary Hill schoolhouse. For decades, it had stood half swallowed by ivy and memory. Its wooden frame bowed under the weight of storm damage and municipal neglect. But when the floorboards were lifted and the substructure exposed, something unexpected halted the process entirely. Hidden beneath the rotted boards of the western wing was a sealed room. Small, windowless, lined with stone rather than timber. Its walls were smooth, almost polished, like the inside of a crypt. At its center, a simple wooden chair, bound with iron clasps. A mirror, shattered, and beneath the chair, an old rusted bell, the kind used in religious ceremonies. But it wasn't the objects that terrified the workers. It was the sound. When they broke the seal to the room, someone claimed to hear humming. No machinery ran that day, no radios, yet several witnesses described the same thing, a low, wavering tone, like a child holding a single note of a hymn. The workers refused to continue. The site was officially condemned, the chamber resealed with concrete, and the blueprints altered to reflect unstable terrain. But the local historical society took interest. They pulled records, traced ownership. What they discovered was that the land had once been part of the Wexley estate, donated to the city in 1856 under the condition it be used for the moral and spiritual formation of youth, and that the building's architect, Ezra Malone, had never designed another structure again. He left Louisiana 2 months after completing the schoolhouse, moving west into the Sierra Nevadas, where he lived in seclusion until his death. His journals were never published, but one loose page surfaced in 2001, auctioned anonymously. It read, "Her instructions were precise. She said the room had to listen. It had to remember. That pain, repeated often enough in one place, becomes an echo that never dies. She said when the right child sits there again, the echo will finish its sentence." Who was Ruth Wexley really building that school for? The popular belief has always been that she was a twisted missionary, a delusional zealot bent on sanctifying pain. But what if that's only half the truth? What if the schoolhouse wasn't a correctional facility for broken girls, but a cathedral for something older? Several researchers, most notably Dr. Anthony Greaves of the University of Louisiana Folklore Department, have argued that Wexley's methods resemble a pattern seen in pre-colonial Creole spiritual sects. These sects, rarely documented and often violently suppressed, believed that suffering was a currency, one that, when spent properly, opened doors between the physical and the spiritual. But these weren't the doors of liberation. They were doorways of invitation. One sect in particular, the Chambre du Silence, or Chamber of Stillness, was said to believe in vessels of remembrance. According to their lore, children born during eclipses or under silent births, where the child did not cry, were marked. Not blessed, not cursed, marked. These children were believed to be vessels for ancestral memory, capable of absorbing the unspeakable, housing voices too old for language. Dr. Greaves proposed that Ruth Wexley either descended from or adopted these practices, reclothing them in Christian language to avoid suspicion. But her intention remained the same, to build a sanctuary for something that didn't speak, but wanted to be heard. The 12 girls may not have been victims in her mind. They were candidates. Which brings us to a letter, found in 1974, hidden in the lining of a trunk donated to the New Iberia Historical Society. The trunk belonged to Sister Henriette LaSalle, a former nun who left the order in 1854, citing irreconcilable spiritual disagreements. Inside the trunk were personal effects, some religious documents, and a single envelope addressed to the one who finds what should have stayed buried. Inside the envelope, I watched her pray in reverse. I watched her bless blood. I watched her teach the girls to mouth psalms backward in the mirror, each syllable scraped from the wrong side of the soul. And they obeyed because they were alone, and because she loved them exactly the way a cage loves a bird. She told me once, "You cannot ask them to forget, but you can teach them to remember quietly, and quiet memory is the strongest kind." I did nothing. I said nothing, because I, too, remembered something I could never name. And it is easier to stand next to darkness than to step into the light and see how much of your shape has already gone missing. If you read this, she is not gone, only paused. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably real, the ink tested authentic, the paper 19th century origin, the confession damning. Sister Henriette had known. Others likely had too. But the silence around Ruth Wexley was not just fear, it was complicity. Her reach extended beyond the school, into clergy, into civil record offices, into families who benefited from her donations, her medicine, her influence. Which explains why the official count, 12 children, is almost certainly incorrect. The real number may never be known, but one final piece, recovered only recently, has reignited the case. In 2020, a man named Javier Luna purchased a sealed crate at an estate sale in Natchez, Mississippi. Inside were 14 identical dolls, each handmade, dressed in tattered replicas of 19th century gowns, each labeled with a girl's name stitched into the hem: Miriam, Abigail, Cora, Josephine, and one doll held a folded scrap of paper pinned to its back. On it, written in faded ink, "This one stayed still the longest. Her silence was beautiful." DNA testing of the cotton in the doll's stuffing revealed something impossible. Trace amounts of human tissue, skin cells, consistent with pre-adolescent females of European and Creole descent, dating to the mid-1800s. These were not toys. They were memorials. Or worse, vessels. So the question becomes, if Ruth Ann Wexley believed silence was a sanctuary, what was she building it for? And has it ever left? Because even now, visitors who pass the condemned site of Calvary Hill report strange things. A persistent ringing in the ears, the sensation of breath on the neck, and in one documented case, a woman claimed to hear a child's voice, clear as a hymn, whisper, "Tell her I'm ready now." We move next into Part 6, where we will explore the diary of a survivor. Someone who remembers Ruth not as a ghost, but as a teacher who never stopped listening. The diary arrived anonymously in 1996, wrapped in butcher's paper, with no return address. It was postmarked from outside of Lafayette, Louisiana, and delivered directly to the archives room of the Iberia Parish Courthouse. No note, no explanation. Just a book. Worn leather, clasp rusted shut, the initials EB carved faintly into the cover. The archivist on duty, a woman named Deidre Vance, nearly discarded it, but curiosity got the better of her. And she pried the clasp open with a letter opener. What she found inside rewrote the final chapter of Ruth Ann Wexley's legacy. The handwriting began small, slanted, the words stitched tightly together like secrets forced to share a bed. The opening page read, "My name is Elise Bernard. They said I died in 1853. I did not. She let me go, and I do not know why." The rest of the diary unfolds as a quiet horror. Day by day, entry by entry, a child trying to make sense of the unthinkable. Elise was 9 when she was sent to Wexley's school. Her mother had succumbed to yellow fever. Her father, a gambler and a drunk, relinquished her to the Sisters of St. Perdure, who placed her in Calvary Hill. "For correction," the note read, "for the sins of her blood." Elise describes the school as cold, but not physically. "The walls were soft," she wrote, "not like wool, like thinking, like standing too close to someone else's thoughts." She mentions the other girls by name: Miriam, Cora, Josephine. All names later matched to burial records, save for hers. She recalls their rituals, silent mealtimes, chanting backwards hymns at dusk, kneeling in what they called the listening room, the same sealed chamber found under the western wing. There, Ruth Ann Wexley would select a girl each week. The girl would sit in the iron-bound chair while the others stood in a circle. Wexley would whisper something inaudible to the seated child, place the cracked mirror before her, and ring the small ceremonial bell once. The sessions would last hours. The girls were forbidden to speak of what they saw. But Elise, in her diary, did speak. "When it was my turn, I saw someone sitting in the mirror. Not me, not Ruth. She was older than both of us. She had stitches on her mouth and eyes, but I could feel her smiling. Not happy, hungry." Ruth said her name was only a sound, not a word, that it couldn't be written, that I didn't need to understand it, only remember it, that she was here long before us and needed a shape, that we were practicing. It becomes clear, entry by entry, that Ruth wasn't torturing the girls randomly. She was shaping them, listening for something specific in their screams, or silences. Elise writes of being praised for her stillness, not for her obedience. She was the only girl who never cried. Ruth said I was quiet in the right way, not empty quiet, listening quiet. She said I remembered well. One day, Elise was pulled aside. Wexley brought her tea, spoke gently, and handed her a small music box. Inside, a melody Elise had never heard before, simple, slow, and unfinished. Ruth told her, "When you hear the last note, you'll know she's awake. Until then, you'll sleep far away from this place, like a seed buried too deep." The next entry jumps a full week. Elise describes being loaded into a horse-drawn cart at dawn. No goodbye, no luggage, just a box of dry bread and the music box tucked into her apron. A nun drove her 2 towns over and left her with a farming family who had recently lost their own daughter. They took her in, renamed her Marie, and raised her in silence. She never told them what she'd seen. The music box remained sealed until the day she died. According to the archivist's research, Elise, later known as Marie Bernard, lived to the age of 52. She never married, no children. In 1897, her death was recorded with a peculiar note. Body found with smile. No visible trauma. Music box open. Final note still playing. That final line sparked a flurry of academic and folkloric debate. Music boxes, as most collectors know, can't play indefinitely. The idea that a final note was still playing long after her death defied explanation. Some speculated it was metaphor. Others believed it to be ritualistic programming, that the melody had been internalized so deeply by Elise it played as her final thought. But more disturbing than the box itself was what Elise wrote in her last entry. "I don't know if I survived. I only know she let me go, but I never left her eyes. Even when I married another name, she blinked through me. I see her in the dreams I don't remember. I hear her in songs no one else knows. When the bell rings again, I won't wake up, I'll return." If this book finds you, it means the note is almost over. The diary ends there. No signature, no flourish, just a blank page, except for a small, fingerprint-sized stain near the margin. Forensic testing confirmed the stain was human blood, aged over a century. What makes Elise's account so vital is that it rewrites Ruth Ann Wexley's intention. She wasn't simply killing. She was building something, shaping children into memory keepers, vessels tuned to a frequency older than language. She wasn't erasing them. She was planting them, like seeds of a consciousness that might one day bloom. And if Elise's account is true, at least one of those seeds lived. So we must now ask, how many others were let go? How many walked among us, carrying fragments of her? And what was the final note? A sound, a word, a ritual, or a signal? In Part 7, we open the sealed letters between Ruth Ann Wexley and a man she only referred to as the grave digger, a correspondent who warned her of the consequences of finishing the melody. His words, "If she sings, the soil will split. Memory is the last sin, and you've taught it to speak." The letters were bound in twine, sealed in wax, and hidden beneath the false floorboards of the Calvary Hill Rectory, beneath a square of stone deliberately misaligned with the others. A groundskeeper named Lowell Carter found them in 1973, while dismantling what was left of the storm-damaged West Wing. He nearly discarded the bundle, mistaking it for a stack of spoiled hymnals. But when the top page shifted in the wind, he noticed the signature. It wasn't Ruth Ann Wexley's. it was simply signed G. Inside were 12 letters, each written in a firm, angled hand with near mechanical precision. No flourishes, no warmth, no wasted ink. The first was dated October 9th, 1849. The final letter, August 3rd, 1853. 3 weeks before the final fire. The contents were disturbing not just for what they revealed, but for who they revealed. The writer identified himself only as the gravedigger. He was never officially named in any parish record, but a line from letter 4 makes reference to a past burial at Montclair Asylum. The child with no face and too many teeth, as he put it, suggesting the gravedigger wasn't merely a poetic title. He was a burial specialist, likely contracted by multiple institutions, who had long worked in the shadows of America's darker medical and religious sites. Letter 1 opens with a warning. Ruth, you are not the first to find her, but you may be the first she allowed to stay. I write not as an enemy, but as a delay. You must stop the melody. You've opened her memory too wide, and you've tuned the children too well. This reference to the melody confirms what Elise Bernard's diary suggested. Ruth was conducting something more than ritual. She was composing, using human memory as her sheet music. The gravedigger's warnings only become more urgent with each letter. Letter 2. You believe you're building a bridge, but bridges only hold until something crosses. She is not curious. She is hungry. Your school is not a sanctuary. It is an invitation. Every silence is a yes. Every girl you silence is an echo of her name. Ruth never wrote replies, or if she did, they've never been found. But the gravedigger's letters don't read like unanswered pleas. They read like a dialogue, a one-sided negotiation with someone who no longer feared consequence. In letter 5, his tone shifts. You have taught the bell to ring by itself. That was her first condition. The second will be the mirror. If the glass begins to warm, you've gone too far. You must not let it reflect her mouth. A closed mouth is a closed door. That phrase, a closed mouth is a closed door, repeats several times throughout the letters. It later appears in Elise's diary and is etched into the underside of the ceremonial chair found in the listening room. In each context, it seems to imply that Ruth was attempting to control something's emergence, something that needed both music and memory to manifest. The gravedigger claims to have witnessed similar phenomena elsewhere, in Havana, in Vienna, in an unnamed monastery in Syria. Each site had been silenced through fire or burial, not to kill her, but to scatter her voice. His goal, it seems, was to prevent Ruth from reassembling the lost melody of whatever consciousness she had discovered. In letter 8, he writes, She lives backwards. She remembers in reverse. Every time you forget, she learns. That is her gift. That is her trap. You think you're saving the girls from sin, but you're teaching her how to be believed. That word, believed, recurs in nearly every letter that follows. The gravedigger begins to shift his warnings into invocations, as if attempting to contain the very act of language. Some of his sentences are written in mirror script, others in Latin so degraded it borders on code. Letter 9 is almost entirely redacted, with strips of cloth sewn over words, as if he feared reading them aloud might be enough to awaken her. But the most chilling moment comes in letter 11. The gravedigger describes visiting Calvary Hill under the guise of inspecting foundation damage. He claims to have seen a girl, Elise, standing alone in the courtyard at dusk, holding a mirror the size of her own torso. She was staring not into it but through it. She wasn't seeing herself. She was waiting for herself. She knew she hadn't arrived yet. He approached her and asked if she was all right. The girl looked up and said, When she breathes again, The walls will hum. Who? He asked. The one who learned to forget. And who are you? He whispered. Her breath, practicing. That final line appears again, word for word, etched into the back of the music box found with Elise's body in 1897. This confirms the gravedigger and Elise met at least once, and that their encounter left a mark deep enough to survive decades. In the final letter, dated days before the fire, he leaves her a last warning. You have tuned too many voices. She will sing, not to rise, but to replace. Memory is not storage, it is selection, and you have given her too many to choose from. Do not let the final girl ring the bell. If she does, it will not stop until the last memory ends, and that may not be yours. This passage is now believed to reference Miriam Covell, the final girl selected before the fire consumed the building. Her name appears on no grave. No remains were ever confirmed, and it is believed Ruth Ann herself carried her out before vanishing into the woods. Some now believe Miriam was never a victim. She was the vessel. The final bell was rung, the melody completed, and the story of Ruth Ann Wexley did not end in fire. It began there. In Part 8, we uncover the asylum ledger removed from public record, specifically the entry labeled Specimen R1, and its connection to a sealed wing beneath St. Felice Hospital in Baltimore, where a patient claiming to be Ruth Returned was recorded humming a melody never written, but long remembered. The ledger was water-damaged, bound in flaking leather, and marked only with a single initial, R. It had been locked away in a forgotten cabinet in the sub-basement of St. Felice Hospital in Baltimore, where records from defunct asylums were once archived, then abandoned. Most entries were routine, outdated patient logs, intake forms, medical inventories. But wedged between two hollowed-out ledgers was something different. A file labeled Specimen R1. The handwriting was neat, methodical. The ink was brown with age, but not smeared. Someone had taken great care not to damage it, not out of reverence, but perhaps out of fear that destroying the document might release something they had only barely contained. The first page read, Patient record, Gnome R1, admitted September 18, 1853. Admitting physician, Dr. Alistair Broom. Condition, nonverbal, melodic mutism, harmonic echolalia. Signs of catatonic trance when exposed to bells, organs, or tuning forks. Notable behaviors, carries no identification. When asked for her name, hums a lullaby matching no known composition. Age estimated 16 to 20. Estimated origin, Calvary Hill, Georgia, spoken once during sleepwalking episode. There was no name, no photograph. But someone had sketched her face in charcoal, long black hair, hollow cheeks, and an expression not of fear, but recognition. She was drawn with her mouth slightly open as though always about to speak, yet never deciding what language to use. On the second page, written in a different hand, were 5 words. Do not let her hum. The medical notes that followed are clinical, but they spiral into something else. Dr. Broom initially believed the girl suffered from a trauma-induced fugue state, brought on by religious or auditory hallucinations. He attempted treatments common for the time, bloodletting, ice immersion, even induced vomiting. None of it altered her state, but one thing became clear. She could hear things others could not. She would wake suddenly during the night and murmur, "Stop humming." She would refuse to enter rooms with stringed instruments claiming they listened too loudly. And whenever the chapel bell rang for Mass, she would enter a trance-like state, mouth moving as if singing, but no sound escaping. Eventually, she was relocated to a padded room beneath the west wing. No windows, no sound. But the humming persisted. Not from her. From the walls. A nurse named Josephine Keller wrote in the margins of one file, "It isn't her humming, it's through her." The walls answer her breath. When she sleeps, the paint flakes in patterns. When she breathes, the ceiling pulses. She is not possessed. She is a mirror of something that remembers itself. Then came the most chilling entry. October 21st, 1853. A patient in the adjacent room, a mute child named Hannah, began screaming. When staff entered, Hannah had written the word Ruth over and over on the walls in her own blood. R1 was silent during the event, but when asked what Hannah had said, she reportedly whispered, "She's not wrong, I'm remembering myself." The file was sealed shortly after. But the humming didn't stop. Between 1854 and 1857, multiple deaths occurred within the West Wing. 4 nurses, 2 orderlies, and 1 priest. Each was recorded as suicide, but the method was the same. Self-inflicted blunt force trauma to the ears using whatever was available. Candlesticks, hymnals, stone bowls. Dr. Broom's final note is barely legible, but it ends with this phrase: "She has made memory circular. We do not recall her. She replays herself through us." After that, the entire West Wing was sealed. Patient R1 was never transferred. No death certificate was issued. No burial recorded. But blueprints of the hospital show an unlisted subchamber beneath her room, marked only with a symbol, a single closed eye. In 1923, that wing was converted into cold storage. Workers reported strange electrical malfunctions, rapidly draining flashlights and strange rhythms echoing through the pipes. One worker, Joseph Lamont, claimed to have seen a girl in black walking silently through a wall of frost. He resigned the next day. The humming continued. Then it stopped. Until 1966, when renovations began and the West Wing was reopened for inspection. Audio logs from that inspection were preserved on reel-to-reel tape. One technician, Russell Day, described what they found. There was no body, no bones, but there was a chair, facing the corner, with a mirror directly in front of it. The mirror was intact, but the reflection didn't match the room. It was older, more ornate, candles, and something written in the corner that we couldn't read. We tried to film it, but the footage never developed. The mirror came out black. Later that week, Russell disappeared. His apartment was found abandoned, the walls lined with sheet music. Identical notes written over and over again with no staff, no lyrics, just notation. And in the center of his kitchen, a silver handbell. Not from that time. Not from this country. Engraved beneath it, a single word: Ruth. We now believe this is the same bell once housed at Calvary Hill. And according to a private journal found among Elise Bernard's remains, that bell had only one purpose: to call her home. The melody had been scattered, but not silenced. Ruth Ann Wexley had not died. She had simply been distributed, across memories, across generations, across sound. She became an echo, a choice, a weapon of remembering. And now, across the last century, sightings of the silent girl have emerged in every state where the bell was rumored to have been stored. Always the same, a girl in black, hair over her face, never speaking, only humming, and always the encounter ends the same way. With a memory the witness swears never belonged to them. In Part 9, we face the most disturbing truth. The melody has finished. The bell has rung, and Ruth Ann Wexley may not be returning, because she never left. The final bell was rung at St. Cecilia's Convent in Georgia on October 2, 1972. The nuns rang it to mark the end of Mass, like they had done every Sunday morning since the chapel had been founded in 1839. But on that morning, something changed. The bell didn't echo. It rang once, sharp and hollow, and then silence. The birds outside stopped singing. The wind stilled, and Sister Magdalene, a novice who had taken her vows only weeks before, fell to her knees in the nave and whispered a name she had never heard before. Ruth. Witnesses said she began humming. Not softly, loudly, rhythmically. It wasn't tuneful, but it was structured, like something ancient waking up through her lungs. Then she started walking, past the altar, past the tabernacle, toward the back of the chapel, where the old confessional sat untouched since the war. She opened the door. No one ever saw Sister Magdalene again. They found only her veil and a folded black dress inside the booth. The floor beneath it was scorched. Forensic teams claimed the burn patterns didn't align with electrical wiring or candle ignition. There was no heat source, no trace of carbon, just one charred word etched into the floorboards: listen. In the decades that followed, sightings of Ruth Ann Wexley increased. But they weren't just sightings. They were auditory intrusions. Children across Georgia, Virginia, and Maryland reported hearing a girl humming in their closets. Recordings captured on reel-to-reel tapes began including unexpected harmonic interference, like background music matching no known key. Audio engineers reported it as ghost tuning, an unexplained alignment of frequencies that created fleeting melodic patterns. But it was always the same 6 notes, played once, then silence. In 1984, a musicologist named Dr. Harper Belson compiled over 40 examples of this phenomenon from hospitals, radio stations, and schools across the Southeast. Each recording contained the same 6-note pattern. He traced it back to a hymn book printed in 1843 by the Calvary Hill Mission, a small Protestant offshoot founded by the Wexley family. The hymn had no lyrics, no title. It was listed simply as "For the One Who Knows." Belson began publishing papers about auditory recursion, how a melody, once heard, could embed itself in the brain's neural pattern and re-emerge years later, independent of memory or intention. He argued that certain sounds might carry not just emotion, but identity. That melodies, when designed precisely, could act as carriers of human imprint. He called it melodic resurrection. And then he went silent. On May 2, 1986, Belson vanished from his home. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, just a broken cassette recorder, a mirror turned backward, and his piano with 6 keys missing. The pattern matched a tuning only one hymn ever used, "For the One Who Knows." In '92, a student named Lily Osborne wrote her thesis on American folk legends and included a section on Ruth Ann Wexley. She dismissed it as regional folklore, an exaggeration of hysteria, orphan trauma, and post-war spiritualism. Her professor advised her to cut the chapter. She refused. 2 weeks after graduation, Lily was admitted to St. Agnes Psychiatric Hospital in Charleston. She'd been found wandering barefoot through a churchyard at night, humming and whispering that she had met the girl in black. Her diary, recovered later by her sister, contained the last coherent thing she wrote before being institutionalized. "She is not haunting us. We are haunted by what we let her become. She was not born a killer. She was given the role. The melody was the ritual. The bell was the key. The silence was permission." You can't kill something once it has become memory. The truth we now face is this. Ruth Ann Wexley may have been a child, a victim, a mind fractured by violence, starvation, isolation. But she was also something else, something shaped by what the world demanded her to be. Each institution that touched her, school, church, hospital, asylum, didn't try to understand her, they tried to name her. And in naming her, they created her. They carved her into myth because they couldn't explain her. They demonized her because she didn't obey their pattern. They buried her by folding her into melody, hoping the echo would be soft. But it wasn't. It remembered. And now the sound has returned. There are reports, credible ones, from audiologists and historians who have listened to the restored wax cylinders from Calvary Hill. They say the hum doesn't fade. It stays in your ears after you remove the headphones. That if you hum it back, the pitch shifts on its own. That your voice begins to match hers. Some even claim they've dreamt of a girl in black at the foot of their beds, not moving, not speaking, just waiting, listening. The files that remain are sealed. The bell has not been seen since 2001, when it was stolen from a museum in Savannah. The suspect was never caught. But the security footage shows a woman, face obscured by a lace veil, carrying no bag, no tools, and walking with deliberate, silent grace. When the bell was lifted from its case, the museum's sound systems all failed, and the only thing recorded by the internal audio feed during the theft. 6 notes. Then silence. We tell ourselves that serial killers are born of cruelty, that evil comes with a pattern we can measure, diagnose, even prevent. But Ruth Ann Wexley was not a pattern. She was an answer to something we forgot we asked. She lived in sound. She fed on memory. And she didn't kill for pleasure. She killed to stay present. So if you hear it tonight, just 6 notes from an unseen source, do not hum it back. Do not remember the melody. Do not say her name aloud. Because the macabre history of Ruth Ann Wexley is not finished. It is still being composed.